She was just a lonely little girl, lost in the snow, with no name, no past, only a purple coat and a secret hidden in a locket. When a cold-hearted millionaire stops to help her, he has no idea that she's about to thaw everything he ever buried. But when he opens that locket, everything shatters. A letter, a name, and a truth that will break him. Who is this mysterious child, and why does she look at him like she's known him her whole life? Stay till the end, because the final word she says will melt even the coldest heart. She was just a lonely little girl, lost in the snow, with no name, no past, only a purple coat and a secret hidden in a locket. When a cold-hearted millionaire stops to help her, he has no idea that she's about to thaw everything he ever buried. But when he opens that locket, everything shatters. A letter, a name, and a truth that will break him. Who is this mysterious child? And why does she look at him like she's known him her whole life? Stay till the end, because the final word she says will melt even the coldest heart. The wind howled across the frost-bitten horizon, cutting through the towering trees that bordered Ethan Blake's private estate like frozen guardians of a forgotten world. Snow blanketed everything, the iron gates, the marble statues, the quiet paths, muffling the sound of life and turning the morning into a silent painting of solitude. Ethan stepped out of his glass-walled mansion, the cold immediately nipping at his cheeks, though his mind was elsewhere, on mergers, deadlines, strategy. His Ferozi-tailored suit shimmered faintly under the pale winter sun, immaculate as always, his silk tie tucked neatly beneath his trench coat. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud the air, then began his walk down the garden path toward the driveway where his chauffeur awaited. Each footstep crunched against fresh powder, echoing softly in the stillness, but something felt off. His blue eyes narrowed as he scanned the grounds. He'd walked this path hundreds of times, but something tugged at his instincts today. A distant shape caught his attention, a speck of color that didn't belong in the snow's pristine white canvas. It lay near the wrought iron gate, small and still, like a forgotten doll left behind in a storm. At first, he thought it was trash, maybe a crumpled scarf, maybe a fallen garden cloth, but then it moved, barely, just a tremble. Ethan's breath hitched. He took a step forward and then another, urgency stirring in his chest, overtaking business, ego, schedule. The closer he got, the more the shape took form. A child, curled tightly, shoulders convulsing in small spasms from the cold. Her purple winter dress stood out like bruised velvet against the snow, her limbs trembling with each shallow breath. Golden strands of hair spilled from beneath a thin hood, dusted with snowflakes, clinging to her pale forehead like frozen silk. Her fingers were tucked under her arms, her knees drawn to her chest, but her lips were blue, eyes fluttering weakly. Ethan stopped for half a second, stunned. She looked like a ghost of innocence, abandoned in the dead of winter. Then he moved. He knelt beside her, snow soaking through his suit pants, but he didn't care. The world outside this moment no longer existed. Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice cracking from shock. Her eyes opened slowly, barely, shimmering with the unmistakable blue of frozen oceans and silent heartbreak. She didn't speak. She simply looked at him, as if unsure whether he was real or another hallucination the cold had conjured. "You're okay now. I've got you," he whispered, already peeling off his coat and wrapping it around her fragile frame. Her body flinched at the warmth, unsure whether to accept it or run. He saw fear in her, not just from the cold, but something deeper, more ancient. He scooped her up gently, feeling how impossibly light she was, as though the wind could have carried her away. Her head dropped onto his chest, and a broken sigh escaped her lips. "Please," she mumbled, voice like shattered glass. "Don't leave me." That one sentence pierced him deeper than anything he'd ever heard. He held her tighter, shielding her from the cold, from the silence, from everything. He turned and sprinted back toward the house, heart thundering louder than his footsteps. The snow fell harder now, as if trying to cover its guilt. "Help! I need blankets, hot water, now!" he shouted as he burst into the grand foyer, startling his staff. Maids and butlers scrambled, bringing whatever they could. He gently laid her on the velvet couch near the fireplace, kneeling beside her, rubbing her hands, whispering soothing words. A tear trailed down her cheek, freezing before it reached her chin. "Who are you, little one?" he murmured, brushing wet hair from her eyes. She didn't answer. She stared into the fire like it was the first real thing she'd seen in days. His private doctor arrived within minutes, unzipping his medical bag, taking vitals, giving reassurances. "She's severely cold, but no frostbite. She needs rest, warmth, food," the doctor said, voice low. Ethan nodded, but didn't move from her side. His phone buzzed. A board meeting in 15 minutes. He silenced it without looking. This child, this moment, this ache in his chest, they suddenly mattered more than any empire he'd built. He studied her again, the curve of her lashes, the bruised lips, the raw innocence. "Where's your family?" he asked softly, but again she said nothing. She clutched his coat tightly around her, as if it were armor. In that moment he realized he had never felt more helpless, or more human. "Don't worry, little snow angel," he whispered. "You're safe now. I promise." The fire crackled, casting golden light over them, melting snow from her hair. She blinked slowly, as if trying to stay awake, to believe him. The butler returned with soup, a thick blanket, and a stuffed bear from the guest room. Ethan tucked the blanket around her, careful not to wake her. But her tiny hand slipped out, grabbing his fingers. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The gesture alone said everything. Trust, fear, longing, hope. He felt something shift in him, a subtle unraveling of walls he didn't know he'd built. She was no longer a stranger. She was now a question etched into his soul. As the fire warmed the room, Ethan sat beside her, unmoving, listening to her shallow breaths, watching the snow blur the world outside. He had no answers yet, no name, no reason, no idea where this path would lead. But for the first time in years, he wanted to follow it. She had appeared like a whisper in the snow. Now, she was a storm in his heart. She stirred slightly beneath the thick blanket, her fragile body curled like a wounded bird near the flickering firelight. Ethan hadn't moved in minutes, yet his heart raced as if he'd run for miles. The room was still, and except for the soft crackle of flames and the slow rise and fall of her tiny chest. He didn't know why she had this effect on him, only that something in her presence shattered his carefully constructed world. Then her fingers tightened faintly around his hand. A soft voice broke the stillness. "Please, don't leave me." Her words barely floated above a whisper, but they hit him with the force of a hurricane. Ethan inhaled sharply, his throat suddenly dry, his grip on her hand instinctively tightening. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured, voice hoarse with emotion he didn't recognize in himself. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing stormy blue eyes that blinked slowly like she was still caught between sleep and fear. He leaned in gently, trying not to overwhelm her with movement. "You're safe now, I promise," he added, softer this time, as if each word needed to convince her soul. She looked around the grand room slowly, the chandelier above, the roaring fire, the velvet couch, and then back to him. "You're not mad at me?" she asked, barely forming the question. "Mad?" he echoed, stunned. "Sweetheart, why would I be mad at you?" Her gaze dropped to the floor, her voice barely audible. "I wasn't supposed to bother anyone." Ethan felt something break inside him. The innocence in her guilt, the quiet shame in her survival. It was unbearable. "You didn't bother me," he said, kneeling closer. "You saved me from a morning of pretending I had everything." She blinked at him again, confused but comforted. "I was looking," she whispered, words drifting like smoke. "For who?" he asked gently, already knowing it mattered more than anything. She paused. Then, her lips parted. Someone. Mommy said I'd know him when I saw his eyes. Ethan froze. His stomach twisted, though he didn't know why. He masked it quickly, brushing snow-damp hair from her forehead. What's your name, sweetheart? Sophie, she said softly, like it was a fragile truth she hadn't spoken in a while. He repeated it in his mind. Sophie. It felt familiar, too familiar, but impossible. He shook the thought off. Where's your mommy now? He asked cautiously. Sophie's face turned toward the fire again, eyes glazing over. She told me to find him if anything happened. That wasn't an answer, but it told him more than silence ever could. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. He ignored it. His priorities had been rewritten the moment she said his name. The mansion doors creaked open behind him. The doctor had arrived. Dr. Ramsey stepped in with his usual calm, experienced presence. She's stable, he announced after a quick check. No signs of frostbite, but she needs rest, nutrition, and emotional grounding. Ethan nodded, absorbing every word. Will she be okay? He asked, sounding more like a father than a billionaire CEO. She will be, especially if she stays in warm, safe hands, the doctor replied, giving him a knowing look. Sophie didn't let go of Ethan's hand through the entire checkup. She stared at him like she was clinging to the only solid thing in her collapsing world. After the doctor left, Ethan sat beside her again, gently offering her warm soup. She tried, but only managed a few slow spoonfuls before her body leaned back, exhausted. You live here alone? She asked after a long pause, glancing around the quiet mansion. He hesitated. Yes, he finally said. Just me and too many empty rooms. Sophie looked up at him, eyes too wise for her age. Doesn't it get lonely? It wasn't a question he'd ever considered, but now, sitting beside her, he realized it always had. He smiled faintly. Not today. She smiled too, small, crooked, tired, but it lit something warm in his chest. Do I have to leave? She asked, voice suddenly filled with dread. No, he answered quickly. Not unless you want to. Tears welled in her eyes, then spilled silently down her cheeks. She didn't sob. It was quieter than that, more broken. I don't want to be alone. One again, she said, each word like a plea. You won't be, he whispered, voice steady. I swear it. She nodded and leaned into his side, closing her eyes slowly. Ethan pulled the blanket tighter around her, his heart pounding beneath his suit. Outside, snowflakes continued to fall like soft confessions from the sky. But inside, something far more powerful was unfolding, the beginning of a bond neither of them understood. A bond that would rewrite everything. She was supposed to be a moment. But already, she felt like forever. The fire burned low, casting long golden shadows across the marble floor as the mansion settled into a hushed stillness. Sophie slept curled against the side of the couch, fingers still gently clasped around Ethan's cuff, like she feared he might vanish if she let go. Ethan, still in his suit though it was now rumpled and damp at the knees, sat quietly on the adjacent armchair, staring at her as if she were a riddle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. The snow outside continued falling in slow, swirling waves, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were no longer with boardrooms or investments. They circled the girl like protective wolves, restless and anxious. She hadn't eaten more than a few bites. She hadn't mentioned a single name apart from Mommy, and not once did she ask for a phone, a number, a place to call home. Ethan rose and walked softly across the room, careful not to wake her. He stepped into his private study, leaving the door cracked just wide enough to hear if she stirred. Inside, the walls were lined with tall shelves and framed awards. A gallery of achievements, but none of them comforted him now. He opened his desk drawer searching for something, anything, to link this child to someone. Nothing. No note in her pocket, no bracelet, no address. He had never felt so powerless despite being a man who controlled everything. He rubbed. bed his temple, then glanced toward the shelf across the room. On it sat a silver-framed photo that had gathered a soft coat of dust over time. He walked over and picked it up with a quiet sigh. It was a photo of Julia, his ex-wife, taken 7 years ago on a winter trip to Vermont. She was laughing in that picture, head tilted back, her hair caught in the wind, cheeks red from the cold. He stared at it for a moment, the familiar ache stirring in his chest. They had parted bitterly, too much ambition, too little compromise. And then, like snow melting in spring, she was gone. He never saw her again. There had been whispers from friends that she'd moved away quietly, started over somewhere unknown. He tried to find her once, but life, and pride, got in the way. Now her face stared back at him like a ghost, frozen in time. Suddenly, a quiet voice broke the silence. "Is that Mommy?" Ethan turned sharply. Sophie was standing in the doorway, still wrapped in the blanket, her hair a golden tangle, eyes wide and trembling. He froze, the photo still in his hands. What did you say?" he asked slowly, every muscle in his body locking in place. Sophie stepped into the room, barefoot, silent. Her gaze never left the photo. "That's her," she said softly, nodding. "That's Mommy." Ethan felt his grip tighten around the frame. He looked from Sophie to the photo, back again. It couldn't be. Julia never had a child. At least, not with him. "Sweetheart," he said carefully, "are you sure? That woman in the picture, where did you see her?" Sophie's expression didn't change. "She used to sing that song, the one about the stars and the blanket. I remember her singing it when I was sick." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. That lullaby. Julia made it up one night when they were still married, a silly, gentle song she never sang for anyone but him. His chest tightened. Coincidence? It had to be. Still, he lowered himself to one knee, eye level with her. "Sophie, where did you and Mommy live?" he asked, voice quieter now, almost breaking. She looked away, unsure, like she was reaching through fog. "I don't know the name. There were trees, a red door, and a swing in the backyard." His heart pounded faster. Those exact details, they matched Julia's childhood home. He had been there once, long ago. He stared at Sophie again, searching her face for Julia's features, the curve of her chin, the eyes. No, this couldn't be. Could it? He stood abruptly, placing the photo back on the shelf as his thoughts scrambled for logic. "She's just confused," he told himself. "Trauma, hunger, cold. They do things to the mind." But the shaking in his hands told another story. Sophie had walked back to the couch and curled up again, this time facing away. Her small voice drifted behind her. "She told me I'd find him, that he'd know me when he saw my eyes." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. He just stood there, surrounded by books and silence, staring at the photo of the woman he once loved, and the girl who just might be the answer to a past he thought was long buried. Ethan stood frozen as Sophie's tiny voice echoed in the vast silence, the photo of his late ex-wife still gently trembling in her small hands. He wanted to correct her, to say no, that couldn't be her mother, but something held him back. A chill ran deeper than the winter wind outside. "She just looks like someone I used to know," he whispered, but his voice betrayed him. Sophie didn't press. She only nodded and quietly leaned into him. That night Ethan told his staff to prepare the guest room for her. She needed rest, safety, warmth, and something inside him begged to keep her close. He wasn't sure why, but sending her away felt unbearable. She was no longer a helpless girl on the snow. She was now a question burning in his soul. The days that followed were quiet yet deeply stirring. Sophie, still fragile, would wake to hot cocoa and cartoons on the velvet couch. She smiled wider each morning, her cheeks pink with health and hope. Ethan started canceling meetings, delaying mergers, a rarity for a man like him. He found himself watching her more than his portfolio. In one moment, she'd be giggling at the puppy-shaped foam in her mug, in the next, staring into space as though she remembered something she couldn't say. Every time she said Ethan, his name felt brand new, as if it belonged to someone better. One afternoon she tugged on his sleeve with a bright grin. "Want to see the snowman I made for you?" He stepped outside with her, watching her dance in the snow like a winter fairy. Her golden curls bounced as she fixed buttons on the snowman's belly. "See," she said, beaming, "he's got a tie just like yours." Ethan laughed, genuinely, perhaps for the first time in years, but behind the joy, questions piled like the snow on his shoulders. She knew things he never told her. She hummed a lullaby his ex-wife used to sing. She liked her apple slices peeled, just like his daughter would've, if she had ever been born. He brushed the thought away and helped her shape another snowball. She threw it lightly, and he let it hit his chest. "I win," she giggled, hands in the air. That night, he watched her fall asleep under a blanket of stars stitched into her comforter. She looked so peaceful, like a dream the world tried to bury. He closed her door gently, but not before brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. Downstairs the fireplace flickered, the only witness to his restless pacing. Who was she? Why did she feel like someone he'd lost? He sat on the edge of the sofa, staring into the flames, then reached for an old photo album he hadn't touched in years. There she was, his late ex-wife, smiling with a hand on her belly. His child. The one he was told hadn't survived. Ethan's heart pounded against the weight of the album. He turned to the next page. Hospital records, silent, final. But the timeline was vague, the names inconsistent. He hadn't asked enough questions back then. He'd just accepted the grief. Grief made you blind. Grief made you harm. You trust the wrong people. He clenched his jaw and looked up at the grand staircase. Sophie. The name had been his wife's favorite. Could this be? No. It wasn't possible. Was it? The next morning, Sophie waited by the window with 2 mugs of cocoa. "You were up late," she said, swinging her legs from the chair. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, taking the mug from her hands. "I had a dream," she whispered. "There was a man in a shiny blue suit. He was holding me, just like you did." Ethan's breath caught again. "Sophie, do you remember anything before I found you?" She shrugged, looking down. "Just cold, and someone saying I had to find you." "Who said that?" She shook her head, eyes misting. "I don't know, but she had a soft voice, like the woman in your picture." He blinked, stunned. This little girl was becoming a mirror to his past, and every reflection pointed back to a truth he hadn't dared to face. Later, as she played with crayons on his office floor, he watched her doodle. 2 stick figures held hands, one tall, one small, beneath a crooked heart. "What's this?" he asked gently. She smiled. "It's you and me. We're family now, right?" His throat tightened. He couldn't speak. She stood up and wrapped her tiny arms around his legs. "Even if I'm a stranger, you still feel like home," she whispered. He carried that sentence the rest of the day like a sacred vow. She was a stranger in his house, but not in his heart. The puzzle wasn't complete yet, but the pieces were fitting too perfectly to ignore. And as the snow fell quietly again outside, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to lose her. Not again. Not this time. The night had fallen softly over the mansion, and the only sound in the vast halls was the gentle ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the library. Ethan sat by the fire, still haunted by the way Sophie had curled into his lap. That morning, as if she belonged there, like she always had. He tried to focus on the book in his hand, but his eyes kept drifting toward the staircase, half expecting to see her tiny figure peeking from the shadows. Just then, a soft clink broke the silence. He turned. Something had fallen near the hallway rug. Rising to his feet, he walked toward the sound and spotted a delicate heart-shaped locket lying on the floor, its silver gleam dulled by age. He picked it up gently, as if it might vanish in his palm. "Sophie must have dropped this," he whispered to himself, turning it over carefully. His thumb found the clasp, and with a quiet click, it opened. He expected a photo inside, perhaps of a parent or a cherished memory, But instead, folded neatly within, was a small piece of yellowed paper. The edges were worn, the creases deep from being opened and closed countless times. His heartbeat quickened. He unfolded it slowly, the scent of time and faded perfume rising from it. The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. Julia's, his late ex-wife's unmistakable script. His fingers trembled. His breath caught in his throat as he began to read. If you're reading this, it means she found you. Her name is Sophie. And she's yours. The words struck like a thunderclap in his soul. The room seemed to spin around him. He stumbled back, collapsing onto the nearest chair, the letter clutched in his shaking hands. Yours? The world stopped. The fire crackled behind him, indifferent to the explosion happening inside his chest. A dozen memories collided all at once. Julia's sudden departure, the pain in her eyes the day she left, the unanswered letters he had written, the years he spent wondering why she disappeared. Now, this? A daughter? His mind reeled, refusing to believe yet unable to deny the evidence burning in his hands. The name, the eyes, the golden hair, her voice, the way she looked at the photo of Julia and said, "Mommy." It all made sense now, a puzzle piece that never fit suddenly locking into place. "My God," he whispered, tears springing to his eyes. "She is my daughter." His voice cracked under the weight of those words. He rose to his feet, letter in hand, pacing the room like a man trapped between joy and devastation. How could Julia keep this from him? Why didn't she tell him? Where had Sophie been all these years? Who had cared for her? And more painfully, why had she ended up alone, freezing, near death outside his gates? A sharp knock on the door startled him. It opened gently, and Sophie stood there in her purple nightdress, clutching a stuffed bear he'd bought her just days before. Her blue eyes looked sleepy but curious. "Did I drop my necklace?" she asked softly. Ethan blinked away the tears and quickly tucked the letter back inside the locket. "Yes, sweetheart, I found it just now." He crouched down and handed it to her, forcing a smile through the storm inside him. She took it with both hands and looked at him as if sensing something had shifted. "You okay?" she whispered. Her question nearly shattered him. How do you answer that when your world has just been rewritten? "I'm just thinking about someone very special," he said gently. She tilted her head. "Was it the lady in the picture?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes. Her name was Julia." Sophie's eyes softened. "She used to sing to me." That simple sentence punched the air from his lungs. He stared at her, and for the first time, didn't see a stranger. He saw Julia's smile in her dimples, her fire in Sophie's tiny temper, her kindness in the way Sophie tucked her bear under his chin when he looked tired. He couldn't hold back anymore. He opened his arms, and Sophie, as if understanding everything without needing words, walked into them and hugged him tightly. His arms wrapped around her like they were made to fit there. His soul ached from the beauty and the ache of it all. He closed his eyes, burying his face in her golden hair, the same hair he used to wear on his fingers through in his dreams. The locket hung from her neck, pressed against his chest now like a secret heartbeat between them. Minutes passed, neither moved, and then, she whispered, "Do you think Mommy sees us?" He couldn't speak. He just nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I think she brought you here," he finally managed. Sophie looked up at him. "I was looking for someone, but I didn't know who. I think I found him now." And in that moment, all the broken pieces in Ethan Blake's heart realigned. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but beautifully. As if the universe had bent backward to reunite what fate tried to separate. As the fire crackled beside them and snow fell gently outside the windows, Ethan realized he would never let her go again. Not now. Not ever. Ethan couldn't breathe. His fingers trembled as the letter's final words echoed in his skull like church bells in a silent graveyard. "Her name is Sophie, and she's yours." The fireplace crackled behind him, its warmth now meaningless against the avalanche of cold truth swallowing him whole. His pulse pounded in his ears as he sat frozen on the edge of his leather couch, The letter clutched so tightly in his hand the fragile paper began to crumple. He stood abruptly, as though motion might undo the shock. He stumbled to his liquor cabinet, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, but didn't drink it. Instead, he stared into its amber depths, as though the answers might swim up from the bottom. His mind darted to the past, to Julia. Her smile, her voice, the way she used to trace his jaw with her fingers in the quiet hours. Then came the image that haunted him still. The day she vanished. No note, no closure, only silence. He had searched, called, waited, wondered. But eventually the trail went cold. She had vanished like snow in spring. And now, this little girl. Sophie. His Sophie? He glanced down the hall where she slept, unaware of the emotional typhoon crashing through his chest. His hands, normally so decisive in boardrooms, now shook like those of a frightened child. He picked up his phone with hesitance and searched for Julia's last known contact, her sister, Madeline. He hadn't spoken to her in years. The line rang. Once, twice. Then, hello? The voice was older, brittle, like leaves at the end of autumn. Madeline, he said, his voice tight. Silence. Then, Ethan? He exhaled shakily. I need to ask about Julia. And a little girl named Sophie. The silence was heavier now. Then a muffled sob. You found her, Madeline whispered. You found Sophie. Ethan's knees buckled and he sank to the floor. Is she mine? His voice cracked. Yes, Madeline said softly. Julia never stopped loving you. But something broke her back then. She left to protect herself. And Sophie. Ethan felt the world tilt. Why didn't she tell me? She tried. The letter was her way. She wrote it years ago, but she never had the courage to send it. His jaw clenched. Where is she now? The silence stretched. She's gone, Ethan. Julia died. In a car crash 6 months ago. I buried her myself. The words hit like bricks to the ribs. He dropped his phone. The sound of it hitting the hardwood echoed through the room like a final heartbeat. Gone. She was gone. And he never got to say goodbye. Never got to ask her why. Never got to hold her one last time. The pain curled inside him like smoke in a burning house. He pressed the locket to his lips, tasting old metal and unshed grief. Sophie, that little girl sleeping under his roof, was his flesh, his blood, his daughter. All this time. And she had been right there, calling his name like it was the only truth she knew. He stood and moved like a ghost down the hall. He opened the door to her room and watched her sleeping, curled up, one tiny hand resting on the stuffed bunny he'd given her. Her golden hair fanned across the pillow, her little lips slightly parted. Innocent, unaware, and utterly his. Tears blurred his vision. He stepped closer, knelt by her bed, and brushed a wisp of hair from her cheek. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I should have been there. I didn't know. I didn't know. His voice broke. Her tiny hand reached out in her sleep, found his, and held it. His heart cracked open. In that single touch, he felt everything, the years lost, the love denied, the second chance he never imagined he'd get. He sat beside her for hours as the storm outside thickened, snow falling like heaven's quiet apology. The locket still hung in his hand, its letter now folded beside his heart. Ethan stared out the window, watching the snow cover the world in white, a blanket of silence and forgotten truths. He remembered the snow the day Julia left, how cold it was, how empty the world had felt. And now here it was again, but this time, Sophie was here, alive, breathing, waiting for answers, for warmth, for love. He would not fail her, not again. When morning came, and she opened her eyes to find him still there, she blinked sleepily. You stayed, she said. He nodded, voice thick with emotion. I'm never leaving again. She smiled and curled closer to him. The truth had buried itself in snow, but love had finally dug it out. And Ethan knew now, his life would never, ever be the same again. Ethan stood in the grand silence of his study, the letter from Julia still trembling in his hand, the inked words burning into his chest like wildfire as the weight of everything he had lost, and everything he might still have, collided in his heart. But before he could process the storm inside him, he heard the softest footsteps behind him, barely a whisper on the hardwood floor, and when he turned, Sophie stood there, small and unsure, clutching the hem of her purple coat with trembling fingers, her blue eyes wide and wet like morning frost under sunlight, and she said nothing at first, just stared at him with a look that felt like destiny itself had paused between them, and then he knelt slowly, carefully, his voice barely audible. "Sophie, there's something I need to ask you," and her lashes fluttered like the wings of something fragile trying not to break. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, the tremor in his voice betraying the war of hope and fear roaring inside him, but Sophie didn't speak, instead reaching into her coat pocket with hands that seemed too small to carry a moment so big, and pulled out a faded photo, its edges bent and corners worn like it had lived 100 lifetimes in her tiny hands, and when Ethan took it, the breath in his lungs stopped altogether. It was a picture of him and Julia, years ago, wrapped in laughter and young love on a sunny day he barely remembered, but now would never forget, and she whispered, barely audible, "Mommy said I'd know you, when I saw your eyes," and at that moment, something cracked so violently inside him he had to clutch his chest to keep it from spilling out, and tears, warm and uncontrollable, rushed down his cheeks like a storm released after years of drought, because it wasn't just recognition, it was reunion, it was resurrection. It was a love he thought had died finding breath again in the form of this little girl who had walked through the snow alone, just to find him, and she stepped forward hesitantly, lifting a hand to his tear-streaked face, and said the word that collapsed every wall he had ever built around his heart. "Daddy?" And Ethan couldn't speak. He couldn't even nod. He just pulled her into his arms, and held her as if letting go would tear the world apart. As if every heartbeat he'd missed in her life could be stitched back together in this embrace, and she melted into him, fitting so perfectly in his arms like she had always belonged there, and he rocked her gently, whispering broken apologies into her golden hair. I didn't know, again and again, but Sophie simply pressed her cheek against his shoulder and said, "Mommy said you'd come, when I needed you the most." And those words, so soft and sure, shattered him completely, because she had never doubted him, even when the world had given her every reason to, and he pulled back to look at her. Really look at her, noticing now the curve of her smile so much like Julia's, the flicker of determination in her gaze that mirrored his own, and it struck him, this wasn't just a moment, it was the beginning of a new story, of a bond that had waited silently under years of snow and silence to bloom into something that neither time nor distance could destroy. And Sophie, sensing the shift, wrapped her arms tighter around his neck and whispered, "I'm not alone anymore." And Ethan, with a voice full of cracked emotion and fatherly pride, finally answered, "No, sweetheart, not ever again." Ethan didn't sleep that night. He couldn't, not after hearing her tiny voice call him Daddy, with so much fragile hope wrapped around a single word that shattered and rebuilt his heart all at once. The house, once sterile and quiet, now echoed with soft footsteps and sleepy giggles, and every sound reminded him that this little girl had changed everything. He stood in front of the mirror, tying a tie for a meeting he was already planning to miss, because some part of him no longer cared about boardrooms or balance sheets. Only breakfasts with heart-shaped pancakes and tiny feet tapping against kitchen tiles. Sophie sat at the counter, swinging her legs as she colored, and when she smiled up at him and said, "I like it when you stay home," his throat clenched with something that felt like both joy and grief. The adoption process began that very afternoon. Papers signed, fingerprints scanned, officials informed, and as the ink dried on a future he never imagined, Ethan looked over at Sophie, who had fallen asleep holding his hand, and he quietly whispered, "I won't miss another day, I swear." But promises couldn't silence the storm rising inside him, the relentless whisper of guilt. Why hadn't he searched for Julia when she disappeared? Why hadn't he followed the signs or questioned her silence? And now, with every new memory he made with Sophie, came the painful realization of everything he had lost. He watched her sleep, her hair spilling across the pillow like golden threads, and tears fell silently down his face as he wondered if Julia had ever stood at a window watching their daughter dream, wishing he could see her too. Morning came with sunlight dancing through the windows, and Ethan made her breakfast with trembling hands, burning the toast but making her laugh, and somehow that laugh healed parts of him he didn't know were broken. She wore her purple coat again, even inside, and told him it made her feel safe, and he couldn't help but wrap her in a tighter hug and promise, "You'll never have to feel unsafe again." That night he tucked her in with the same care Julia once gave him, brushing hair from her forehead, and whispering lullabies he never knew he remembered until now. She whispered, "I missed you before I even met you." And his chest caved with emotion as he replied, "I think I missed you my whole life." He found himself canceling trips, ignoring calls, shutting out the world that had once praised his brilliance but never taught him how to hold a child who feared being left again. And while he played tea party and helped her draw stars, he also sat alone in his study at night reading Julia's old letters, aching for the woman he never got to say goodbye to, wondering what fear had driven her away, and if she ever doubted that he would have been a good father. He began talking to her in the silence, whispering things like, "She's beautiful, Jules. And she's so much like you." And sometimes he swore he felt her presence in the soft wind or the warmth of the fireplace. Sophie painted him a picture, stick figures holding hands under a bright sun, and wrote in crayon underneath, "Me and Daddy forever." And Ethan framed it like it was the most valuable art he'd ever owned. Still, when she wasn't looking, he'd stare out the window, haunted by memories he never got to make, tormented by the question of how different life might have been if he'd just found Julia sooner. He brought Sophie to the hill where Julia was buried, her small hand gripping his tightly as he knelt before the stone and whispered, "She found me, Jules, just like you said she would." And Sophie knelt too, placing a daisy beside the grave and saying, "Thank you for keeping me safe, Mommy." They cried together, wrapped in winter scarves and fragile healing, and as snowflakes danced in the breeze, Ethan pulled her close and whispered, "This isn't the end, this is the beginning, for both of us." They built a snowman that day beside her grave, laughing through tears, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt peace, not because the pain had vanished, but because love had taken its rightful place in the center of everything. That night, she called out to him during a thunderstorm, and he rushed to her room, heart pounding to find her sitting up with wide eyes, whispering, "I thought you left." And he scooped her up without a word, holding her tightly and rocking her until the storm passed, murmuring, "I'm not going anywhere, baby. Never again." He started saving all her drawings, keeping them in a box labeled Sophie's Forever, and one day she found it and beamed, asking, "You really keep them?" And he knelt beside her, eyes wet, and said, "I keep everything that matters, and you matter most." Together they planted a small cherry blossom tree in the backyard, and she said, "Mommy liked pink flowers," and he smiled through trembling lips, answering, "Then this tree will always bloom with her love." Every day became a new chance to rewrite the story, not erase the past, but honor it. And Ethan, once a man who built skyscrapers, now spent his days building blanket forts and bedtime stories, and in every whispered, "Good night," in every unexpected hug, in every tear wiped from her cheek, he found a redemption he never believed he deserved. The man who had once conquered cities now knelt beside a child and called it his proudest victory. And as the seasons changed and the paperwork finalized, Sophie officially became Sophie Blake, his daughter in name, blood, and soul. And when the judge asked if he would love and protect her for the rest of his life, Ethan replied without hesitation, "I already do." They walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, and Sophie looked up at him with sparkling eyes and asked, "Can we get ice cream now, Daddy?" And he laughed, heart full, bending down to say, "Anything you want, sweetheart. Anything at all." The air was crisp, the snow a silent witness as Ethan parked outside the cemetery gates, his hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat, her purple coat zipped high, clutching a small bouquet of lilies, Julia's favorite. Neither of them spoke as they walked the winding path, their breath visible, the world muted beneath a blanket of white. Gravestones stretched endlessly, each one telling a story, but Ethan's eyes locked only on one, the name he once whispered with love, now carved in stone. He stopped at her grave, his knees sinking slowly into the snow, as if the weight of his grief finally demanded surrender. Sophie stood beside him, gently setting the flowers down, her small hand brushing away snow from the inscription, "Julia Emerson, beloved mother, brave soul." Ethan's lips parted, but words failed him, the sorrow inside too large, too jagged to push past his throat. "I didn't know," he finally whispered, eyes glistening. "God, Julia, I didn't know you were gone." Sophie knelt beside him, leaning into his arm, her presence a warmth he never knew he needed until now. "I searched everywhere after you left," Ethan continued, voice cracking, "but you vanished, just disappeared." His hut, and reached out, brushing snow from the stone, as if trying to touch her one last time. "I should have tried harder. I should have fought for you, for us, for her." Tears streamed freely now, falling into the snow, melting it with every drop of regret. Sophie pulled something from her coat pocket, a folded drawing of a stick figure family, a man, a woman, and a little girl in between them. "She told me about you," Sophie said softly. "She said if I ever got lost, I'd know you by your eyes." Ethan looked at her, heart shattering all over again, and pulled her close. "And you did. Somehow, you found me." They sat in silence for a while, snowflakes drifting down around them like falling memories. "I hated you," Ethan said suddenly, his voice bitter. "When you left, I thought you didn't love me anymore." He wiped his face roughly, ashamed. "But now I see. You were protecting her. From me. From my coldness." Sophie looked up, her blue eyes so much like Julia's, shimmering with the same quiet strength. "She said you'd be the best daddy, if you knew." That sentence hit him harder than any storm ever could. He gripped her hand, trying to hold back a sob, but it escaped, raw, human, unfiltered. "I'm so sorry," he choked, pressing his forehead to the grave. "I missed everything. Her first steps, her first words, all of it." Sophie wrapped her arms around his neck from behind, resting her cheek gently on his back. "I didn't need perfect," she whispered. "I just needed you." Ethan closed his eyes, breathing her in, feeling the broken pieces inside him slowly, painfully shift into something whole. He stared at the name on the grave again, a million thoughts running wild. Memories of her laughter, the smell of her coffee, the way she used to fall asleep on his shoulder during long drives. "She never stopped loving you," Sophie added quietly. "Even when she was sick, she kept your picture by her bed." Ethan turned, tears clinging to his lashes. "She was sick?" Sophie nodded. "For a long time, she didn't want you to see her like that." Grief turned to anger, then softened again into, "Oh, guilt. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't anyone?" "She wrote letters," Sophie said, pulling another crumpled paper from her pocket. "But she never sent them." Ethan opened it carefully. Julia's handwriting, shaky yet familiar, poured across the page. "If you're reading this, it means I couldn't hold on, but I hope she found you. She needs you. And maybe, so do you." He pressed the letter to his chest, as if it could somehow patch the hole in his soul. "I do," he murmured. "God, Julia, I do." The wind howled suddenly, but neither of them moved, as if time had frozen just for this moment of reckoning. "I used to think money fixed everything," Ethan said after a while. "Deals, contracts, power, all of it made me feel in control." He looked at Sophie, her cheeks rosy from the cold, but her spirit fierce. "But none of it meant a damn thing, until you." Sophie blinked slowly, snowflakes catching on her lashes. "Then maybe Mommy was right." He laughed through a sob. "She usually was." They stood, brushing snow from their coats, Ethan gently holding Sophie's hand as they turned back toward the car. But before they left, Ethan looked over his shoulder at the grave. "I promise," he whispered. "I'll protect her. I'll love her. Every single day." Sophie tugged his hand. "Let's go home, Daddy." That word still pierced him. Daddy. Not Mr. Ethan or Sir or the man with the mansion. Just Daddy. He opened the car door for her, watched her climb in, and for a moment, just stood there staring up at the gray sky. "I'll make it right," he said aloud. "For her, for you, for us." The road back felt different, less like escape, more like redemption. Sophie leaned her head on his arm as he drove, her breath calm, trusting. "I'm glad I found you," she murmured. Ethan squeezed the wheel. "I think you saved me." No boardroom speech, no quarterly win, no headline ever made him feel this full, this alive. As they pulled into the driveway, the lights of the mansion flickered on, no longer cold and hollow, but glowing. Home. Ethan turned off the engine but didn't move right. The way he looked at Sophie, who had fallen asleep, fingers still curled gently around his wrist. His eyes welled up again, but this time, it wasn't pain. It was peace. "I lost everything once," he whispered, "but somehow, life brought me back to what matters." He picked Sophie up in his arms, careful not to wake her, and carried her inside through the snow. Each step forward felt like letting go of the past, and finally stepping into the future. The wind whispered softly through the cemetery trees as Ethan stood still, Sophie's tiny hand gripping his tightly. Her words, "This is home now, Daddy," still lingered in the chilled air, wrapping around his soul like a lifeline. Ethan looked down at her, his eyes misted, but this time not from grief, from grace. He knelt beside her, brushed a snowflake from her golden hair, and kissed her forehead gently. "Let's go," he whispered. "We've got something to build, together." 2 days later, the conference room buzzed with confusion. Cameramen, reporters, investors, all waiting for a major corporate announcement. The room hushed as Ethan Blake stepped onto the podium, not with a briefcase or graphs, but holding Sophie's hand. She wore a soft cream coat with a sunflower pin she insisted her mother once gave her. Ethan's navy coat flapped slightly as he adjusted the mic, cleared his throat, and looked directly into the crowd, not as a CEO, but as a man who'd been shattered and slowly put back together by the smallest hands. "I know you were expecting numbers," he began, voice calm yet weighted, "but today it's not about shares, or market value, or profits." A pause. Cameras flashed. Sophie squeezed his fingers. "It's about second chances, about a woman I lost, and a little girl who helped me find my heart again." Murmurs rippled across the room. "This is my daughter Sophie," he continued. "And today, in honor of her mother, Julia, I'm launching the Julia Grace Foundation." He clicked a remote, and behind him, a screen lit up with an image of a warm house nestled in snow, golden lights glowing from within. "This foundation will build and fund shelters for abandoned, orphaned, and lost children. No child should sleep on the street, no child should go unloved." The crowd, previously skeptical, now leaned in, eyes softened, some wiping tears. "Because once," he added, voice cracking, "I was too blind to see what truly matters, but she showed me." He glanced down at Sophie, who beamed proudly. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was tender, like a prayer answered. Investors nodded, journalists set down their pens. One whispered, "That's the real headline." That evening the two walked through Central Park, a dusting of snow falling like confetti. Sophie kicked at soft piles of white, giggling as her pink boots left tracks beside Ethan's. "Can I have pancakes tomorrow, Daddy?" she asked. Ethan laughed, a full, unguarded laugh he hadn't let out in years. "Only if you help me burn them again." Sophie grinned and swung their hands between them. "Deal." As they reached a bench, Ethan sat, pulling Sophie onto his lap. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady heartbeat she once searched for in crowds. "Do you think Mommy can see us?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked up at the sky, stars blinking like memories. "I know she can, and I think she's smiling." He pulled out a small box from his coat pocket, a velvet one. Inside was Julia's locket, now fitted with a new photo, Sophie and Ethan, smiling under the snowfall. He opened it slowly, showing it to her. "This is your legacy," he said. "Not the company, not the money. This." Sophie touched the photo with reverence. "It's perfect," she whispered. Later that week, the first brick was laid for the shell. A restored Victorian house with yellow shutters, just like the home Julia once dreamed of. Sophie helped paint hearts on the front door. Ethan, in jeans and paint-streaked hands, didn't flinch. As kids ran through the halls laughing, for the first time, the echo in his life was filled, not by silence, but by joy. Reporters asked for interviews, but Ethan refused. "The real story," he said, pointing to the children, "is right there." He watched as Sophie hugged a girl who'd arrived with a single blanket and no shoes. "She gave her my socks, Daddy," a volunteer chuckled. Ethan smiled. "She's her mother's daughter." One night, after hot chocolate and storybooks, Sophie crawled into bed and tugged Ethan's sleeve. "Sing me that song again," she said, "the one Mommy loved." Ethan hesitated, then softly sang, his voice shaky but warm, the lullaby Julia once hummed in the kitchen while stirring soup. Sophie drifted off before he finished, one hand clutching the photo under her pillow. Ethan lingered by her side long after she slept, his fingers brushing her hair. So much lost, but so much still to build. He whispered a promise to the darkness. "I won't fail her. Not again." The next morning, Ethan stood by the shelter's steps, Sophie in his arms, as snow gently fell around them. A journalist passed by and snapped a photo. Ethan didn't flinch. This time he welcomed it, a frozen moment of truth. The photo would soon be framed inside the shelter, captioned with Sophie's own words. "This is home now, Daddy."